Now, we are very pleased to have, and very honored to have the OECD speaking today. Mr. Douglas Frantz has started his career in the Federal Department, the US State Department, where he was Assistant Secretary of State of Public Affairs and responsible for communication and social media worldwide. He's now Deputy Secretary General of the OECD and in charge of the OECD development agenda. Mr. Douglas Frantz, please.
Thank you very much, Pierre, and thank you to IFTRIP for the invitation to participate in this conference, and good morning to everyone. Over the years, the OECD and its high-level advisory board on financial management of catastrophic risks have engaged in work on terrorism risk insurance alongside IFTRIP. It has been a productive partnership, and we look forward to a deeper engagement going forward. Most of us remember where we were on 9/11. At the time, I was a reporter for the New York Times based in Istanbul, and I was working on a story in Baku, Azerbaijan. My wife called my mobile and said, "Get to a television." I spent the next 2 years in Pakistan, Afghanistan, and many other countries covering the war and the emergence of this new form of terrorism that still plagues us today. All of our lives changed that day. All of us have responded, personally and professionally. I eventually left journalism and went into the working for the US government. I decided that my experience covering terrorism and conflict over 35 years as a journalist might help me find solutions instead of focusing solely on the problems. For me, that search continues at the OECD, and I'm very proud to be here and represent the OECD this morning. And I think our work with IFTRIP and all of your national associations and everyone else is a symbol and a concrete result of the OECD's commitment to helping the world cope with this very serious and deadly problem. The attacks on 9/11 showed that there is a new level of damage that could be inflicted by a coordinated terrorist attack. The result was a significant disruption in the availability of financial protection against terrorism risk from private markets. In the nearly 16 years since then, we've seen an evolving level of collaboration aimed at ensuring the availability of insurance coverage for terrorism losses. The OECD very quickly recognized that gap and has played a role in fostering the collaboration. In June 2002, less than a year after 9/11, the ministers from the OECD countries asked the organization to help them prepare for financial consequences of possible large-scale attacks and to provide compensation for such unforeseeable events. The OECD's Insurance and Private Pensions Committee responded by setting up a task force on terrorism insurance, which is comprised of government and industry experts. They were asked to develop analysis and recommendations on how to define and cover terrorism risk and to assess the roles of the insurance industry, financial markets, and governments. This included coverage of mega-terrorism risks. 4 years later, in 2006, the High-Level Advisory Board was established at the OECD. The work on terrorism insurance became part of a broader work stream on managing financial impacts of large-scale catastrophes, both man-made and natural. Since then, the board's work has produced policy analysis papers and a series of international conferences to share the experiences and best practices all across the world. Let me list just a few of those results very quickly. In the fall of 2004, there was a conference on terrorism and other large-scale risks, which led to a seminal report, Policy Issues in Insurance, Terrorism Risk Insurance in the OECD countries. In 2010, the first international conference on terrorism risk insurance was organized jointly by the OECD and the Australian Reinsurance Pool Corporation with RMS and Guy Carpenter. The heads of 9 terrorism insurance programs of OECD member countries participated, along with the national programs of Israel, which was not yet an OECD member, and Russia. A second international conference on terrorism risk insurance, also jointly organized by the OECD and the Australians, was held at OECD headquarters in Paris in December 2012. There, 10 risk insurance pools from OECD member countries and 3 non-OECD countries were represented. The third international conference on terrorism risk insurance was organized jointly by the OECD and the U.S. Department of Treasury in Washington in September 2014. In response to a request made by the heads of the pools in Washington, the OECD launched the International E-Platform on Terrorism Risk Insurance. This platform remains the primary hub for profiles of the 13 country programs. Through these meetings and ensuing analysis, the OECD helped lay the foundation for IFTRIP, and IFTRIP, in turn, has improved collaboration between governments and the private sector to address the challenges of responding to the financial impact of terrorism. Fortunately, we have avoided a major terrorism attack on the scale of 9/11, but the threat remains as tangible as ever. The number of high-profile attacks from Paris, Brussels, Nice, San Bernardino, and Istanbul to Orlando, and more recent events in London and Manchester have clearly placed this risk at the top of the policy agenda in many countries. Targeting civilians is an age-old terror tactic, so it's no surprise there has been a shift towards softer targets, particularly as harder targets become more secure. The result is a new risk profile. If 9/11 showed the devastating impact of a major terrorist attack, attacks like those in Paris and Nice and other cities demonstrate another impact, the loss of business income, particularly in tourism sectors. The significance of these losses are evident here in Paris. Tourist visits were down 6.4% in the first 6 months of 2016 compared with the previous year. In real numbers, that translated to 1 million fewer visitors and 750 million euros in lost revenue. The second significant development since 9/11 is the threat from cyber terrorism. There is a growing awareness, as we saw just yesterday, of the potential harm from targeted cyber attacks, whether by terrorists or criminal gangs. Indeed, understanding the motives behind a cyber attack, figuring out whether it was an act of terror or a crime, the real attribution of it, is very difficult, and that makes your jobs difficult too. In late 2014, a cyber attack on a German steel mill caused material damage at the plant by stopping them from shutting down a blast furnace. In December 2015 and again in December 2016, cyber attacks disrupted the power supply in Ukraine. Those two episodes demonstrated the potential for cyber attacks to cause significant economic damage to the world's infrastructure. Were they terrorist attacks or state-backed incidents? Cyber terrorism raises the challenge of how we define a terrorism act, which often triggers the reinsurance pool coverage. For example, many terrorism pools don't cover business interruption losses resulting from a cyber attack perpetrated by terrorists. Or when it comes to the payment of extortion demands in ransomware attacks, as we're seeing today and last month, how can a company or its insurer be certain that a ransom payment isn't providing financing to a terrorist organization? Different from property insurance markets, there are also some significant barriers to the development of a functioning cyber insurance market. Cyber risk is relatively new, fast evolving, and extremely difficult to quantify. It's an issue that the OECD addressed in a paper for the meeting of the G7 finance ministers and central bank governors last May in Bari 2 months ago. We will publish a more detailed analysis this fall. Among the findings is that the underdeveloped state of the cyber insurance market will have implications for coverage of cyber terrorism by terrorism insurance pools. As this audience knows well, the availability of financial protection for damages and losses inflicted by terrorist attacks is critical for businesses to remain operational. The potential losses from a major terrorist attack are well beyond the means of most companies to manage without insurance coverage. This makes such coverage a prerequisite for business activity in many sectors. The availability of insurance coverage for terrorism risk was severely disrupted by the 9/11 attacks. In response, many governments provided public backing for terrorism insurance. In most countries, the government backstop is provided on a renewable basis, subject to a review of market conditions. Germany, the United States, Australia, and other countries have completed such reviews in recent years, and all of those programs have been renewed. At the same time, reinsurance markets are in the midst of a prolonged soft cycle for many risks, particularly property catastrophe risks. This is because there's a lot of capacity, a number of new players, and a generally benign period for loss experience. This has put pressure on pricing for terrorism risk as well. For example, according to PwC, London market pricing for terrorism risk has fallen annually by 5 to 7% since 2013. Excess of loss treaties have seen larger premium reductions. While market capacity for terrorism-related property damage remains sufficient, thanks largely to the backing of the national pools, some are questioning whether the coverage for terrorism risk is sufficient in other lines of business. This is most notable in areas like bodily injury, cyber terrorism, and business interruption/loss of attraction. This has caused some to consider whether governments should provide a backstop for these losses when they are related to terrorism. It's a worthwhile debate. Countries and companies need to undertake this kind of risk examination to stay ahead of the complex risks and challenges with potentially significant implications. That is a key recommendation of the OECD recommendation on disaster risk financing strategies, which was adopted by the OECD Council earlier this year. The recommendation encourages governments to take an integrated approach to preparing for the financial implications of catastrophic events and to leverage the role of insurance and capital markets in managing the financial impacts. Doing this effectively requires leadership at the national level, and it requires the kinds of discussions in which you are engaging here today. By addressing the implications of these issues, by sharing experiences and expertise about the evolving terrorist threat, insurance markets will have the opportunity to stay ahead of the curve and provide the insurance on which so many businesses depend. The OECD and its high-level advisory board are eager to continue supporting platforms where the leaders of terrorism insurance programs, public and private, can exchange information to create protections that match the threat level. In that regard, we're very grateful to IFTRIP and GARIA for their collaboration in organizing this important event and look forward to taking part in the exchanges today. Thank you very much.